So now let's move on to our final presentation for the day. The presenters are Sarah Bunin Benor from Hebrew Union College and Alicia Chandler from Wayne State University. The title is Perceptual Onomastics, Survey Data on Americans Jewishness Ratings of Personal Names. Sarah Bunin Benor is Vice Provost, Professor of Contemporary Jewish Studies, and Director of the Jewish Language Project at Hebrew Union College. She received her PhD in linguistics from Stanford University in 2004. Her books include Becoming Froom, Hebrew Infusion, and Languages in Jewish Communities Past and Present. Alicia Chandler is a PhD candidate in sociology at Wayne State University, studying non-Jewish spouses of American Jews. She is a research assistant at the Brandeis University's Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. She received her JD from Harvard Law School and her BBA from the University of Michigan. So I will start your recorded presentation now.
Hi, my name is Sarah Bunin Benor.
And I'm Alicia Chandler.
And we're here to talk about perceptual onomastics, survey data on Americans' Jewishness ratings of personal names. Throughout history, Jews have had diverse names, including some from Biblical Hebrew, local variants of biblical names, and local non-Jewish names. And on your screen, you see some examples of those from 10th century Cairo, 13th century England, and 16th century Rome. We started this study with a number of research questions about that. And the question we're going to focus on today is which names do Jews and non-Jews identify as more Jewish or less Jewish? Now, normally, people use contextual clues for assessing whether someone is Jewishness based on their name. For example, if they met that person at a Jewish studies conference or an onomastics conference. If that person lives in New York or Mississippi, or has a New York or Mississippi accent. Also based on jewelry and clothing. And based on phenotype, which can be problematic given that a large percentage of Jews don't have stereotypical Jewish features, especially Jews of color. But our study investigates people's assessments of Jewishness of names in the absence of contextual clues. Our methodology was an online survey based on a pilot survey and 60 pre-tests of the current survey. And our survey included perception questions inspired by perceptual dialectology and quantitative perception studies within sociolinguistics. We distributed the survey in September 2019 using snowball sampling. We sent email invitations to 50 Jewish organizations and connectors and asked them to send the survey around, and we posted it in various social media spots. And we aimed for diversity in the sample based on denomination, ancestry, and other factors. Our sample is over 11,000 respondents, most of whom are Jewish, but we also had 1,900 non-Jewish respondents. For this paper, we developed 3 data sets: respondents, children, and all names. Respondents, we limited to those who were born and now live in the United States. Children are the Jewish children of those US respondents, and all names includes the names of respondents, both their names now and their birth names, and their Jewish spouses. And if their children have other parents that are not their spouses, then we included them too, and also Jewish children's names. Now, this sample is not representative of American Jews or non-Jews, and we compared our sample to the Pew Study of Jewish Americans from 2020. We found that the Jews in our sample are somewhat more engaged in Jewish life. We have a higher representation of conservative, modern Orthodox, and Reconstructionist identifying Jews, and a lower representation of those who identify as Reform, having no denomination, and being in an interfaith family. And compared to another study that looked at non-Jews in relation to Jews, we found that our sample is slightly more connected to Jews than the non-Jews in America more broadly. So based on these sample limitations, we can't make claims about overall percentages of Jews and non-Jews, but what we can do is to confidently compare groups, like comparing Jews to non-Jews or comparing Jews of different ages or denominations. So how did we separate out the Jews from the non-Jews in our sample? With a very complicated question. We said this is the one item in our survey that was required, and there were several options. I am Jewish and was raised Jewish, I converted to Judaism, etc. And the top two were considered Jewish, and the rest were considered not Jewish, except categories 8 and 9, not answering the question, or other, were excluded from the coding. So we then manually coded all of the names in the all names data set. And this is, again, specifically Jews. And we found these numbers of unique names. So over 2,000 names of women and girls, 1,300 names of men and boys, and 195 names of non-binary, intersex, and transgender people. So when we then coded the names, we coded them according to category. And we came up with these categories: Hebrew biblical character, like Hannah, Reuven, and Yechezkel; English biblical character, like Aaron, Abigail, and Ruth; Yiddish biblical character, like Avram, Rachel, and Yehudis; ambiguous biblical character, like Ezra, Leah or Leah, and Miriam, because we don't know how they're pronounced, and even some of them are pronounced the same in Hebrew and, you know, Americanized Hebrew, that is, and English. And then the next category is Hebrew biblical modern, like Avi, Moti, and Rafaela; Hebrew post-biblical, that is, names that are not names in the Bible, the Tanakh, but that developed in rabbinic periods and later, but are Hebrew and are seen as part of the Jewish onomastic repertoire. Yiddish names that are not Yiddish biblical character names, like Bela, Feivel, and Leib; Hebrew modern names that developed in Israel in the modern period, or primarily in Israel, like Ariella, Lior, and Stav; ambiguous Jewish names, these are coded as Jewish, like Emet, because it is the same sound as the Hebrew word emet, which means truth, or Lila, which is like the Hebrew word for night, or Mindy, which is like a Yiddish name, Mindel. And finally, names of no Jewish origin, like Mark, Randall, and Sylvia. Then we asked, if you heard of someone else with your first name, how likely would you be to assume that they were Jewish or not? And we gave them a scale of 0 to 10. And there's a middle option, 5, which is neutral. And we asked them to do this for their own names, their spouses and children's names, and the names of their children's other parents. So what we found was we then came up with a mean Jewishness rating for each category. And then we divided up these categories. If the mean Jewishness rating was 8 or higher, we put it in the distinctively Jewish category. And if it was lower than 8, we put it in the not distinctively Jewish category. And you can see that even the top 3 in the not distinctively Jewish category are rated as above 5, above the neutral rating, but we still considered those to be not distinctively Jewish because they were quantitatively much different from the distinctively Jewish category. And what we see here is a continuum of distinctiveness, that names that are higher up on this chart are considered to be more distinct, whereas names lower down are considered to be more similar to the surrounding society, reflecting more acculturation. And then we also provided 13 girls' names and 13 boys' names in a randomized order so that we would get uniform data from all respondents about this set of 26 names. And this time, in addition to giving them a scale of 0 to 10, we gave them the option of not familiar with that name. And just to give you a sense of who selected that option, very few. So the only names that were above 5% being unfamiliar with each name among non-Jews were Hannah, Elisheva, and Rivka. And for boys, even people were even more familiar with these. Only Eliyahu and Rafi got over 5% of unfamiliarity.
So now we're going to look at the perceived Jewishness, starting with the girls' names. So as Jews and non-Jews had fairly close ratings for most names, and mostly followed similar patterns, rating most of the same names as more likely to be Jewish than other names. So with the exception of Mary, Jews ranked most names higher than non-Jews did. Now, both Jews and non-Jews rated Hebrew biblical character names the highest. So as you see at the top here, we show Rivka, Hannah, and Elisheva, and these names were all rated as definitely Jewish. Going down, next we see some of the English biblical characters' names, like Rebecca and Hannah, falling in the middle, again, both for Jews and non-Jews in their perceptions of the Jewishness of names. Now, the largest discrepancies we found between Jews and non-Jews responses were those names that we were calling ambiguously Jewish names, the names that have multiple origins and sometimes can be interpreted as Hebrew or Yiddish, but may not have been interpreted like that by some of the non-Jews in the study. So some names here would be Eliana, Maya, Lila, and Kayla. Now, each of those ambiguous or coded Jewish names has origins or relations with Hebrew or Yiddish terms, as is shown here on the screen. But again, we expect that maybe not all of the non-Jews, or for that matter, all of the Jews would have had familiarity with these similarities to Hebrew or Yiddish words. Now, going on to perceptions of the boys' names, we see similar patterns. So in this case, Jews almost universally rate all names higher on the Jewishness perception than non-Jews do, but with one exception again, and this perception would be John, spelled John, which was ranked higher in its perception of Jewishness by non-Jews than it was by Jews. Now, there's one example where there's no statistically significant difference, and that is a name Liam. So some Israel-oriented or Jewishly engaged Jews have recently given their baby boys this very popular Irish origin name, but instead of the pronunciation of Liam, it's interpreting it in the Hebrew of Liam, which means my people. So while most people, both Jews and non-Jews, would still see Liam as an Irish non-Jewish name, as we can see from its overall rating, for some people, they might have taken on this new pronunciation and meaning of Liam, my people. So we also tested some pairs of names. So for example, Eliyahu and Elijah. So Eliyahu, which is a Hebrew biblical character name, was ranked highest and much higher than the English equivalent of that name, Elijah. A similar pairing would be Rafi and Rafael. Now, Rafael is an ambiguous biblical character name that could be considered English or Hebrew, and whose Spanish spelling is associated with Hispanic Americans. Now, Rafi, again, a related name, is a Hebrew biblical modern name, and is just an Israeli nickname for Rafael. Now, both Jews and non-Jews rated Rafi high for Jewishness, and Jews rated Rafael as just above neutral, while non-Jews rated as not Jewish, perhaps again associating it with Hispanic Americans rather than Jewishness. Now, the third minimal pair that we tested was John. So John with the H and without the H. Now, Jews rated John, Jon, as neutral, perhaps considering it short for Jonathan, which is the English version of the Hebrew biblical name Yonatan, while non-Jews considered it not Jewish. Now, both Jews and non-Jews rated John with an H very low. Now, these three examples, these three minimal pairs, show how people make assumptions about Jewishness based on small clues, like whether or not a name has an H or whether a particular nickname is used. Now, English biblical characters' names can be found at all levels of Jewishness for boys. So we go from over 8 in the example of Judah, both to under 4 for the example of John, again, without the H. Both Jews and non-Jews rate Judah quite high, likely because of its historical associations with the Jewish people, and Yehuda is the source of the name Jew in many languages. Now, we also included a few names not of Jewish origin that have become associated with Jewish immigrants or their children, such as Irving or Max. So Irving ranked middle to high, and Max ranked a bit higher than neutral among Jews and a bit lower amongst non-Jews. Now, Richard was the one name we tested with no Jewish or Christian associations and had no biblical origin, and that name also ranked relatively low. We also wanted to look at certain factors as related to the perception of names. So with many names, there is a changing trends over time, and we wanted to look at that. So what we found is that when we looked at Jewishness, perceptions of Jewishness by decade of birth, older Jews tended to give higher ratings to certain names like Judah, Max, John, Richard, and especially Irving. Is very clear here that the age of the respondent differed in how they might perceive the name and its Jewishness. Looking at women's names, we also saw similar trends for Mary, Elizabeth, Kayla, Rose, and Hannah. Now, another factor is denomination. We split our respondents into the Orthodox respondents and non-Orthodox respondents. And as you can see, for many names, there are differing perceptions of the ratings of Jewishness based on Orthodoxy. So Orthodox Jews, including modern Orthodox and Black Hat Jews, rated some Hebrew biblical names, Hebrew biblical modern names, and ambiguous names as more likely to be Jewish than non-Orthodox Jews do. And non-Orthodox Jews rate some English biblical character and ambiguous names as more Jewish than Orthodox Jews do. And also Max, one of the names that are associated with immigrants and their children that was recently reclaimed among many non-Orthodox Jews, is also in that category where non-Orthodox respondents rank it higher. We also asked families with children what their plans were at the time of the birth of their first child. So did they plan to send their child to a non-Jewish school, or did they plan to send their child to a Jewish school? And we hypothesized that parents might perceive certain names as more Jewish if at that time they were planning to send their children to a Jewish school versus a secular school. And indeed, that was the case for 4 of the 5 coded Jewish names: Eliana, Maya, Liam, and Kayla. And you can see in those that if you for those respondents who intended to send their children to Jewish schools, they perceived these names as more Jewish. I'll turn it over to Sarah for the conclusions.
So to sum it all up, we find that there are these, that we can compare the ratings between Jews and non-Jews for the perceptions of Jewishness, but note that it's all a continuum, right? That there are there is some possibility that Judah could be Christian and that Mary could be Jewish. It's not 100% in any of the names. And we find that despite the popularity of English biblical names in America, especially since the 1970s, Jews and non-Jews do associate English biblical names with Jews to varying extents. We also find that Jews and non-Jews associate Jews with their most widespread historical languages, Hebrew and Yiddish. And we find that Jews rate most names as more Jewish than non-Jews do, indicating that they perhaps view the world through Jewish lenses or have heightened Judar. And I want to just point to some limitations of our study. Our sample is not representative, and to compile such a sample would be very expensive. And we did not specify the age of the hypothetical people whose names respondents were rating. So you could think of Elijah and Rebecca as little kids or as old people and have very different understandings of the Jewishness of their names. Also, the data we're presenting here is synchronic, collected in 2019, and there might be change over time in perceptions that isn't reflected in age patterns, there might be life stage effects, like people get older and then start to think of certain names in different ways. And so it would be helpful to repeat this study in 20, 40, or 60 years to determine whether this is age grading or actually change in progress in onomastic perceptions. Also, we haven't yet analyzed the qualitative data in our survey. People did submit comments about the 26 names that they rated, and we do have data on why do you consider your name or your spouse's, children's, etc. names to be Jewish or not. So we could analyze that data and get a little more nuance in this whole conversation. And we look forward to continuing this research and submitting an article soon. And we welcome your comments and questions to help us hone our analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation of the data. I've got so many questions, but I see there are many in the chat as well. So I'll start there. And while I'm reading the ones in the chat, please do raise questions if you have them. I see that, Sarah, you responded to the first one in the chat. So I'll start with the second question that appears. Eva says, I'm wondering how important the spelling is because I have a Hispanic student called Eliana, not Eliana. My British best friend's name from high school is pronounced Maya, but spelt M-A-J-A, Maya.
Thanks, Eva. We did take that into consideration in our coding process. There were some names that we coded in different categories based on different spellings, like Rafael. If it was spelled R-A-H-E-L, we coded it as Hebrew biblical character, whereas if it was R-A-C-H-E-L, we coded it as English biblical character, because it could be Rachel or Rachel, but R-A-H-E-L would not be Rachel. And yes, Eliana could be, well, that's one of those coded Jewish names. So, but there would be other examples with like Maya, where if it was spelled M-A-Y-A, it would be in the ambiguous Jewish category. And I think we coded, no, actually, I don't think we had any that were coded as not ambiguously Jewish. There are multiple spellings of the name Maya. Yeah.
And I would just note that obviously, in addition to spelling can indicate pronunciation. So like a name that was has an ambiguous biblical name would be David or David. It can be spelled exactly the same way, but when we hear it, we would code it very differently. But because one of the limitations of our study was we were based on writing and spelling only, then David an ambiguous name.
Thank you. Cleve, you have your hand raised.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I mean, I learned a lot. I mean, I knew that Eliana and Lila and Kayla had Hebrew interpretations, but I had no idea Maya had a Hebrew interpretation. I mean, in my mind, Maya is African American. You know, I had no idea that there was a Hebrew analysis for that. Liam, it's, you know, both really interesting, but not a huge shock to me that in Israel they've given it a Hebrew interpretation so they can give it, because it's like the universal fashion at the moment. It's not only #1 in the US, it's in the top 10 in like the Netherlands and Belgium and Switzerland and Sweden and even Slovenia, you know, at the moment. So it's like everywhere across Europe, you know, people love it at the moment. And the only reason it's not in the top 10 in Britain anymore is because it's past its fad. They had the fad for it before everybody else did. So.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one, because there are some names that become really popular in Jewish communities just because they're popular elsewhere. But this one happens to be popular among Jews who are highly engaged in Jewish life, whose other children have distinctively Jewish names that are Hebrew biblical character names or Hebrew modern names.
While we're waiting, I do have one. I was wondering if the data that you've collected is it keyed to the sort of the geographic origin of the one taking the survey? Because I'm kind of wondering, like I've lived in several places in the U.S. and I could think of the communities that I was a part of would answer these questions very differently. You know, coming from the Midwest, living in the South, now in New England.
Our data was not, we did ask for both the current residents of the respondent as well as the respondent's birthplace, but that was limited to a country level. So we cannot code by, for US Jews, for example, interior geography, though I agree, I assume there's going to be differences. For example, I did not know the new meaning of Liam as in West. I don't think it is caught on in the same way it is caught on in some other parts of the country. So,
but we did ask about the Jewish density of the place where respondents currently live, if they live in a place that they consider to be heavily Jewish or moderately Jewish or not very Jewish, and that does correlate pretty strongly with the Jewishness that the Jewishness of the names they chose for their children.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that response. Any other questions? I see a few other notes in the chat. Yeah, another respondent says, interesting study. I hope you will be adding surname research in the future. Oh yeah, and that was the first question that you received from Alexa. Something that I have noticed in my family is that branches of the family that have Jewish sounding surnames, for example, Prince, chose not particularly Jewish sounding first names for their kids, but those with a not Jewish sounding surname, i.e. Larson, all have very Jewish sounding first names like Esther and Enoch. The only exception is my uncle, who was adopted, and for him, our grandparents doubled down, Aaron Prince. It almost seems like the whole family was collectively wanting to sound Jewish, but not, quote, too Jewish, unquote.
and I think that's a really interesting point. And as Sarah responded in the chat, also, obviously, there are some privacy concerns whenever you're asking questions about names, and especially if you're attaching first names to surnames. But I will note, as far as the desire of people in choosing names to want their children to be able to be perceived as Jewish versus not, that obviously changes very much over time. And that's something we've looked at in the study, specifically the children's name data set. And one of the things we did look at was the dividing point of 1970s, as many on this group may know, that there was a rise in acceptance of both ethnic names and a desire to embrace ethnicity that increased with time, as well as a certain additional adoption of biblical names. So both that trend combined with a perception of decreasing anti-Semitism led people over time to be more comfortable with picking these distinctively Jewish names, and therefore wanting that adoption that Alexa mentioned, whereas at other times in history, people may have been less comfortable with that and really not wanted names that appear Jewish in either way. There's very interesting research on surnames and the decrease in changing of Jewish surnames away from distinctively Jewish over time. And while we see the surname changes decrease, we also see the increase of adoption of distinctively Jewish first names.
I think that was a really powerful presentation on which to end. Thank you both for this excellent paper. We're really looking forward to reading it once it's published. And that will conclude our conference.